The wind howled through the cracks of the wooden cabin like a living thing trying to claw its way inside. Thomas Harper pulled his threadbare blanket tighter around his shoulders and watched his breath form white clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the Montana winter had turned the world into a hostile wasteland of snow and ice. Inside, it wasn't much better. Thomas had come west 3 years ago with dreams bigger than the sky itself. He'd read the pamphlets in Philadelphia, seen the drawings of fertile land and golden opportunities. The government was practically giving away homesteads to anyone brave enough to claim them. At 28, with nothing but debts and a dead-end job at a textile mill, Thomas figured he had nothing to lose. He'd been wrong about that. The 160 acres he'd claimed sat in a valley between two mountain ridges, beautiful in summer but absolutely punishing come November. His nearest neighbor, old Bill Hendricks, lived 4 miles east. The trading post was a full day's ride when the weather cooperated. In winter, Thomas might as well have been living on the moon. He stood from his chair, joints aching from the cold, and fed another log into the potbelly stove. The fire inside glowed weakly, barely pushing back the darkness. He'd learned the hard way that burning wood too fast meant running out before spring. He had to ration everything: fuel, food, candles, hope. Thomas walked to the window and scraped frost from the inside of the glass with his fingernail. The thermometer nailed to the outer wall read 14 degrees. Inside, it couldn't be much above 35. He'd hung every blanket he owned to partition off the main room from the rest of the cabin, trying to heat just one small space. It barely helped. His hands were raw and cracked from the constant cold. His face had taken on a gaunt, weathered look that made him appear 10 years older. Worst of all was the loneliness. Days passed without hearing a human voice except his own. He talked to himself just to remember what words sounded like. The cabin itself was his own handiwork, built that first summer with more enthusiasm than skill. The logs didn't fit quite right in places. The chinking he'd mixed from mud and grass had cracked and fallen out in spots, creating drafts that no amount of restuffing seemed to fix. The roof leaked in 3 places when it rained. And the attic, that useless space above the main room, was nothing but a collection point for all his failures. He'd hauled river stones up there the first autumn, thinking he might build an indoor chimney someday. That project, like so many others, had fallen by the wayside as survival became his only goal. Now those stones just sat there, 24 of them, gathering dust and taking up space he couldn't even use. Thomas returned to his chair and picked up the letter he'd been writing by candlelight. It was addressed to his sister Margaret back in Philadelphia. Dear Maggie, he'd written 3 days ago. I hope this letter finds you and the children well. Winter has come early this year. I am managing fine. The cabin is sturdy and my supplies are adequate. All lies, of course. He couldn't tell her the truth. Couldn't admit that he lay awake most nights wondering if he'd freeze to death before dawn. Couldn't confess that he'd made the worst mistake of his life coming out here. A gust of wind hit the cabin so hard the walls actually shook. Snow hissed against the windows. Thomas closed his eyes and tried to remember what warmth felt like. Real warmth, the kind that seeped into your bones and made you sleepy and content. He thought about his mother's kitchen back home, the big cast-iron stove that kept the whole house comfortable. He thought about Margaret's husband's house, with its proper fireplace and thick walls. Hell, he even missed the crowded boarding house where he'd lived before heading west, where body heat from a dozen residents at least kept the worst of the cold at bay. Here, he had nothing but his inadequate fire and his stubborn pride. Thomas stood again and paced the small area near the stove, trying to keep his blood moving. His stomach rumbled. He'd had cornmeal mush for breakfast and a piece of salt pork for lunch. There was more cornmeal for dinner. There was always cornmeal. He paused mid-step, hearing something over the wind. Footsteps? No, impossible. Nobody traveled in weather like this. But there it was again, a definite crunching sound outside. Thomas grabbed the rifle from above the door and moved to the window. Through the frosted glass, he could barely make out a figure stumbling through the snow toward his cabin. Someone was out there, and from the way they were moving, they were in serious trouble. Thomas threw open the door, and a blast of Arctic air nearly knocked him backward. The figure collapsed onto his porch, barely conscious. It was a man, maybe 60 years old, his beard crusted with ice and his lips blue. "Help me," the stranger rasped. Thomas dragged him inside and kicked the door shut. He laid the man near the stove and began rubbing his frozen hands, trying to restore circulation. The stranger's breathing was shallow, his skin like ice to the touch. "What's your name? Where did you come from?" The man's eyes fluttered open. Samuel Wright. "My wagon broke down 2 miles back. Been walking since dawn." Thomas felt his stomach drop. Dawn was 8 hours ago. This man had been exposed to deadly cold for most of the day. He stripped off Samuel's frozen outer layers and wrapped him in the only spare blanket he had, then positioned him as close to the stove as possible without burning him. Over the next hour, Samuel's color slowly improved, but his shivering became violent. Thomas made weak coffee from his dwindling supplies and helped the old man drink it. As Samuel regained his senses, Thomas began to understand the gravity of his situation. He now had 2 men to keep alive in a cabin that barely sustained one. "I'm headed to my daughter's place in Helena," Samuel explained through chattering teeth. "Got caught in the storm. Thought I could make it through." Thomas said nothing. He was doing the math in his head. His firewood might last another 6 weeks if he was alone and careful. With 2 people, maybe 4 weeks. His food stores were even more limited. And if the storm kept up, they might be trapped here together for days or even weeks before Samuel could safely leave. The temperature inside the cabin continued to drop as night fell. Even with both of them huddled near the stove, Thomas could feel the cold seeping through every gap and crack. Samuel's shivering wouldn't stop. The old man clearly needed more warmth than Thomas could provide. "I appreciate you saving me," Samuel said quietly, "but I can tell this is hard for you. I'm an extra burden." Thomas wanted to argue, but the words wouldn't come. It was true. Every breath Samuel took was breath that used up oxygen warming the air. Every inch of blanket he used was an inch Thomas didn't have. The simple mathematics of survival had become brutally clear. As midnight approached, Thomas lay awake listening to Samuel's labored breathing and the relentless wind outside. The thermometer had dropped to 8 degrees. Inside, it felt barely above freezing despite the fire. Samuel moved to the ladder leading to the attic. "Those stones have been sitting up there all winter, right? In that freezing attic space?" Thomas followed him up the ladder. The attic was indeed brutally cold, the wind whistling through gaps in the roof boards. The pile of river stones sat exactly where he'd left them, covered in a layer of frost. Samuel walked over and placed his palm on one of the stones. "Feel this." Thomas touched the stone. It was ice cold, as expected. "Now think about it," Samuel said, his voice gaining energy. "Heat rises, correct? All the warmth from your stove down there is escaping right up through these floorboards and going straight out through your roof. You're heating the Montana sky instead of your cabin." Thomas felt foolish. He'd known heat rose, but he'd never really thought about the implications. "But here's the thing about stones," Samuel continued. "They hold temperature. In summer, these would stay cool. In winter, once warmed, they hold that heat for hours. Your ancestors knew this. That's why castles had stone floors and walls. That's why root cellars worked." Thomas's mind began racing. "You're saying if I brought these stones down and positioned them near the stove?" "Better than that," Samuel interrupted. "If you insulated this attic floor properly, trapped the rising heat up here with these stones, they'd warm up during the day and radiate that heat back down all night long. Like a heat battery. I've seen it work in old buildings back east." For the first time in months, Thomas felt something stir inside him that he'd almost forgotten. Hope. If you're finding this story as fascinating as Thomas finding his solution, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. What happens next will change everything about how this settler survives his brutal winter. They worked through the storm for 3 straight days. Samuel, despite his age and recent brush with death, proved to be a master craftsman. He directed Thomas with the confidence of a man who had built half of Philadelphia in his younger years. Together, they transformed the useless attic into something Thomas had never imagined possible. First, they sealed every gap in the attic walls and roof with a mixture of clay from the riverbank, dried grass, and animal fat. Samuel showed Thomas how to pack it so tightly that not even a whisper of wind could penetrate. The work was exhausting, their fingers numb and bleeding, but they pressed on. Next came the stones. Samuel had Thomas arrange them in a specific pattern across the attic floor, directly above the main living area. But he didn't just lay them flat. He created channels between them, pathways for the rising heat to circulate and warm each stone evenly. The heat needs to flow like water, Samuel explained, his breath visible in the freezing air. Each stone touches the next. They share the warmth between them. By nightfall, they'll all be holding heat like coals in a furnace. On the third day, Samuel had Thomas construct a simple wooden framework that held several stones suspended just above the stove itself. These would heat faster and more intensely, becoming the heart of their thermal battery. They worked into the night, driven by desperation and the faint hope that this insane plan might actually work. Thomas had stopped counting the hours. His body moved on instinct, following Samuel's instructions without question. As dawn broke on the fourth day, they finished. Both men collapsed onto Thomas's bed, too exhausted to even speak. The stove burned steadily below, and for the first time, they had done everything possible to keep that precious heat inside. Thomas woke 6 hours later to something he hadn't experienced in months. He was warm, not just less cold, actually genuinely warm. He sat up slowly, afraid the sensation would disappear. The cabin felt completely different. The air had a weight to it, a thickness that spoke of retained heat. He touched the wall nearest his bed. It was almost hot. Samuel stirred beside him, a smile creasing his weathered face. Feel that? Those stones up there have been soaking up heat all day. Now they're giving it back. Thomas climbed the ladder to the attic. The space was transformed. The stones glowed with retained warmth. When he placed his hand on one, he could barely keep it there for more than a few seconds. The entire attic had become a massive heat reservoir, radiating warmth down through the floorboards into the living space below. The thermometer outside read 6 degrees. Inside, Thomas estimated it had to be at least 55, maybe even 60 degrees. A difference of nearly 50 degrees from just 4 days ago. He had survived winters of brutal cold, but now, for the first time, he understood he might actually thrive. The storm finally broke on the 7th day. Thomas stood on his porch, watching the sun emerge from behind the clouds for the first time in over a week. The world sparkled with fresh snow, pristine and beautiful in a way he'd forgotten it could be. But more importantly, he was watching it from a warm cabin, wearing just a single shirt instead of 3 layers. Samuel joined him, his color fully restored, looking decades younger than the half-frozen man who had stumbled onto the porch that desperate night. "You saved my life," Samuel said quietly. "I would have died out there in that storm." Thomas shook his head. "You saved mine. I was dying slowly in that frozen box. Another month and I would have either frozen or lost my mind from the isolation and cold." They spent that morning preparing for Samuel's departure. Thomas packed supplies for the old man's journey to Helena, insisting he take extra food and a good blanket. Samuel protested, but Thomas wouldn't hear it. "I have heat now," Thomas said with a grin. "That's worth more than food. I can think clearly again. Plan properly. I'll hunt, I'll manage." Before Samuel left, he walked Thomas through the system one more time, making sure the younger man understood how to maintain it. Keep the attic sealed tight. Replace any chinking that cracks. During the day, keep a good fire going to charge those stones. At night, you can let it burn lower because the stones will do the work. You've got yourself a heating system that costs nothing but a little maintenance. Samuel mounted his horse, which Thomas had retrieved from where the old man had abandoned it during the storm. The animal had somehow survived, finding shelter in a grove of trees. "One more thing," Samuel said, looking down at Thomas. "This system you've got now is not just about survival anymore. Come spring, you could teach other settlers. Show them how to build it. There are dozens of families out here struggling just like you were. You could help them." Thomas hadn't thought about that. He'd been so focused on his own survival that the idea of helping others seemed almost absurd. But Samuel was right. How many other homesteaders were suffering through brutal winters in poorly built cabins, not knowing that a simple solution existed. As Samuel rode away, Thomas returned to his warm cabin and sat down at his small table. He pulled out the unfinished letter to his sister and read what he'd written before. "Dear Maggie, I hope this letter finds you and the children well. Winter has come early this year. I am managing fine." He crumpled it up and started fresh. "Dear Maggie," he wrote, "I have learned something remarkable about survival out here. It's not just about enduring the hardship alone. It's about accepting help when it arrives, learning from those who know more, and then passing that knowledge on to others who need it." For the first time since arriving in Montana, Thomas Harper felt like he actually belonged there. 18 months later, Thomas stood in front of 23 settlers gathered in the Trading Post meeting hall. The room buzzed with conversation as farmers, ranchers, and homesteaders from across 3 counties waited to hear what he had to say. Thomas had never spoken to a crowd before. His hands trembled slightly as he held up a piece of paper with his sketches. "Most of you know me as the crazy hermit from the valley," he began, and several people chuckled. "A year and a half ago, I nearly froze to death in my own cabin. I was burning through firewood faster than I could cut it, and I was still cold every single night." He told them about Samuel, about the storm, about the stones in the attic that had saved both their lives. As he spoke, he could see recognition in many faces. These people understood his struggle because they were living it themselves. Thomas showed them his diagrams, explained the principles Samuel had taught him about thermal mass and heat retention. He described how to seal an attic properly, how to position stones for maximum efficiency, how to maintain the system through the seasons. "The difference in my cabin is 21 degrees on average," he said. "On the coldest nights, it can be even more. I'm using half the firewood I used before, and I'm warmer than I've ever been." After the presentation, people crowded around him with questions. A young couple from the Eastern Ridge asked if he would come look at their cabin. A widow with 3 children begged him to help her before next winter. A group of Swedish immigrants, barely understanding English, communicated through gestures that they wanted to learn. Over the following months, Thomas traveled from homestead to homestead. He helped families seal their attics, position their stones, transform their frozen hovels into warm homes. He charged nothing, asking only that they pass the knowledge on to others who needed it. By the next winter, 47 cabins across the region had been retrofitted with stone heating systems. The following year, over 100. Thomas became known not as the crazy hermit, but as the man who had figured out how to beat the Montana cold. He received a letter from Samuel 2 years after their meeting. The old man had made it safely to his daughter's home and was living comfortably in Helena. But the letter that mattered most came from Margaret. She wrote that she'd heard about his work from a newspaper article that had made its way back east. She said their mother would have been proud. That his father, who had always doubted him, would finally have to admit that Thomas had made something of himself. Thomas pinned that letter above his desk, next to the thermometer readings he'd kept from that first terrible winter. They reminded him of where he'd been and how far he'd come. All because of some useless stones in an attic and a stranger who refused to let him waste them. Thank you so much for staying with Thomas's incredible journey until the very end. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, please hit that like button and leave a comment below telling us what you thought. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss our next inspiring true story. And if you have suggestions for stories you'd like us to tell, drop them in the comments. We read every single one. Until next time, remember that sometimes the solution to your biggest problem is already right there, waiting to be discovered. Stay warm, stay hopeful, and we'll see you in the next story.